Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and welcome to another episode of ISTJ Info Dumping. This is hopefully going to be a series of 5 videos where we'll be going through each cognitive function and how it manifests in each position. So this video is going to be focusing on the cognitive functions in the dominant position for every type, and we'll go down the list. I say 5 because I haven't done enough research on what the 5th, 6th, and 8th slots look like. So when I get to video number 5, that's going to be about how each function manifests itself in the 7th position. And to make this a little bit more fun and easier for me to keep track of, I'm going to do it in the order of my own function stack. So we'll start out with introverted sensing and we'll end with introverted intuition. So if you're an INFJ or an INTJ watching this, I hope you have enough patience to put up with my rambling until then. We start out with introverted sensing, which is the dominant function for ISTJs and ISFJs. This function is stereotypically called the memory function, and oftentimes these types have by far the best memory of all the types. They can usually recall with extraordinarily good detail about several things in their personal past, sometimes even over a decade ago, with so much clarity and so much precision that oftentimes other types say that they have a photographic memory. But it's not just having a good memory that defines introverted sensing. That's just part of it. What really defines it is that nearly every decision they make is based on that love of familiarity and routine. Oftentimes, ISTJs and ISFJs love doing the same thing over and over again, and because it's introverted sensing, a lot of what they're recalling and remembering takes place in their head. Oftentimes, they've described their minds as like a filing cabinet, where if they see something familiar, they can immediately recall how similar it was to something in their past. A lot of them describe their observation skills as being like double vision, where like they can see what's in front of them, but then they can also see how it contrasts to something in the past. ISTJs and ISFJs, because they also have inferior extroverted intuition, it can mean that they often don't like experimentation or trying new things. Another thing to note about introverted sensing that I think some of you might be surprised is that I personally think that ISTJs and ISFJs are the most observant of all the types. Now you might be thinking, oh wait a minute, Paul, I'm pretty sure those are the ESFPs and the ESTPs because they lead with extroverted sensing. Extroverted sensing is all about the thrill and the joy of living in the moment, so of course they're also very observant, but the ISTJs and the ISFJs don't only live in the moment, they also live in the past. So not only are they observant of their present surroundings, but they're also observant of what their present surroundings were in the past. So they can say, this happened before. Let's learn from it. And so it's usually very hard to catch one of these types off guard when it comes to what's going on in their environment and what they're noticing. Because unlike the ESFPs and the ESTPs, they're not all about fun and games and being on board, if that's a word. They are just about, it is what it is, let's not filter it. So the best way to tell if someone's using introverted sensing in the dominant is if they are constantly recalling familiar things and if they have a paralyzing fear of trying something new. Next up we have extroverted thinking, which is the dominant function in ENTJs and ESTJs. This leads to them sometimes being called the bulldozer of the Myers-Briggs types, as they tend to have a very clear vision of how things should be, and they often base it off of logic and systematic logic. So not so much an internal processing, but more of it is what it is, these are what the statistics say, this is what objective reality says. And it can lead to them kind of being a bit hasty because they're so confident in what it is that they're realizing. Now, because it's extroverted thinking, this often leads to them being very open about what they're thinking, but it also leads to them wanting to make sure that everyone around them knows what it is that they're thinking. So oftentimes this can lead to them being very bossy and very pushy. They often like to control people and tell them what to do. They're often in positions of leadership. So like CEOs, most US presidents have been ESTJs, and they often can be a bit insensitive. I say a bit, that's a bit of an understatement because their introverted feeling is all the way at the bottom. So this can lead to them being afraid of expressing their emotions and thinking that it makes them weak, but also they don't give a darn about other people's feelings either. So they can often like blast people with "you're a terrible human being" and feel no remorse whatsoever, even if the person outright expresses that it hurt their feelings. A healthy ESTJ or ENTJ doesn't necessarily have to be so mean and aggressive. It just means they're good at getting things done and they're good at being efficient. Usually they're the ones that keep society running. They're the ones that'll make sure like the house is kept in order and that things get done. And I think without ESTJs and ENTJs, society as a whole would collapse. The downside to all of that efficiency is that because they're extroverts, they often have a hard time with silence. I'm pretty sure my dad is an ESTJ because like if he notices that it's too quiet for too long, he'll either put on music or he'll like point out that it's too quiet and just start making conversation about literally anything just to break up the silence. Like sometimes he'll point out some birds that he sees, even if it means interrupting someone else. It's just like, that's what I'm thinking, so I'm gonna say it. So they often don't really have a filter over what they say because again they don't give a darn about how people feel, and so a lot of times they're just like, this is what I'm thinking, I'm gonna say it. Now we move on to introverted feeling. This is the dominant function for INFPs and ISFPs. This leads to them having a very strong sense of right and wrong and what they personally feel is like a good value. I've often heard it described as a moral compass. There is a stereotype that INFPs and ISFPs are the most emotional of all the types, and that they're sometimes called the crybabies of the Myers-Briggs community. This isn't necessarily true, as any type can be emotional. Like that's just a natural human response to have emotions. But they're the ones that are the most in tune with their emotions, and the ones where they like, if they feel something, they act on it without hesitation. There's a phrase called "I think, therefore I am" for the INFPs and the ISFPs. They are "I feel, therefore I am." If they feel a particularly strong surge of emotion, they don't try to hide it like the other types do. They just say it or express it, or even if they don't outright use their words, they find some way to convey it, oftentimes without even trying. They might like glare at you if you hurt their feelings, or they might like stop smiling if you've bothered them. It can lead to them being a bit passive aggressive if they're the types that haven't developed their extroverted thinking enough, which drives me crazy personally because I like people to tell me when they are annoyed. But I think sometimes the INFPs and the ISFPs can get a bit too annoyed, like things are constantly bothering them. That could just be a coincidence with the people I know, but it does seem like they get much more easily triggered than the other types. On the positive side, INFPs and ISFPs often aren't confused about what it is that they want and what it is that their desires are. So it's usually very easy for them to convey like, this would be nice and this is how I feel. And especially if their morals are sound morals, then they're usually pretty good at explaining them and saying like, this is what I believe and I'm going to stick to it. On the downside, unhealthy INFPs and ISFPs often don't like to hear other people's points of views, and even if you objectively prove them wrong, they will obstinately say, no, this is what I believe and you are not going to convince me otherwise. The same can go for like emotions and agendas. Like if you try to tell them like, it's not a big deal, you don't need to worry about that, they're like, of course I need to worry about it. This is how I feel. This is who I am. This is how I am as a person. So a lot of times you just gotta let them feel it out and maybe eventually they'll work through it. Now for the ENFPs and ENTPs, their dominant function is called extroverted intuition. This is a function that's all about ideas and external possibilities. Oftentimes they like to think about the next new possibility, where things could go. What are the next cool new jokes? What are the possibilities of how the universe could be? It doesn't necessarily have to be grounded in reality. Sometimes it can be really crazy and oftentimes very silly. And it can lead to them being some of the funniest types I've personally encountered, because it almost seems like out of nowhere, their ideas just come to them. They often get bored very easily and constantly require either externalizing their ideas or like doing something. But unlike the ESFPs and ESTPs, ENFPs and ENTPs often think more about like the big picture and abstract stuff. So sometimes they can talk a little bit more metaphorical and abstract than I would like, but typically it's not too bad to follow along because it is my inferior function, so to a certain degree I can at least understand kind of where they're coming from. On the downside, extroverted intuitives often don't put much stock in categorization. They often like to sort of see how everything fits together, and so if you try to like put things into boxes or put them in a cage, they'll say, why are you trying to compartmentalize me? Some of them actually reject the Myers-Briggs altogether because they think it's too limiting. They're like, well, I can be any personality I want. I'm flexible. I can be all of the cognitive functions. I can be all of the types. And they'll probably envision ways in which they can fit every single category. So by virtue of not wanting to be categorized, they end up categorizing themselves anyway. So good for you for being a walking paradox. And because it's extroverted intuition, they often like people possibilities. So rather than having a more like focused approach like the INFJs and the INTJs do, ENFPs and ENTPs often like to know what's going on around them with the people around them. So that leads to them like loving to know what people are up to. They love knowing the potential of how people could develop. So a lot of my ENFP friends really like hearing my stories of progress in like things that were previously hindering me. Granted, I think extroverted feelers have their own way of doing that, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Next up, we're getting into the shadow functions for me now. Next up, we have extroverted sensing, which is the dominant function for ESFPs and ESTPs. This is the function that governs them like constantly living in the moment, not the past, not the future, the present moment. Oftentimes, they don't think very hard about where their destiny is, but they don't reminisce very much either. Not that they don't reminisce, but oftentimes they don't care to. I once asked my ESFP friend if she wanted to watch a vlog again. She's like, I already was there. I don't need to see it again. So a lot of times they don't put much stock in remembering things because that happened then. This is now. We want to live in the now. So their extroverted sensing often leads to them constantly wanting some kind of external thrill so that they can, I don't know, not be bored, for lack of a better word. They love adventure. They love trying new things, but unlike the ENFPs and the ENTPs, they like to think about tangible possibilities. They don't like to think about things that are too far-fetched and intuitive-y. They like to think of what can be done. So, for example, they might want to go on a roller coaster. They might want to go swimming. Stuff that's legitimately possible, that can be explained with the five senses. This can also lead to them getting very, very, very easily bored. But thankfully, I've heard that when they're not around people, they can often get their sensory pleasure through other means, such as blasting the music up really loud, or when they're, say, in a windy area and just letting the wind whip through their hair, assuming they have hair. And it can also lead to them being very observant, but it can also lead to them not learning from their mistakes, which is why I think that ISTJs and ISFJs are actually more observant than they are. Next up, you can tell I'm getting more and more tired because I actually have to think about how these unfamiliar functions are playing out. Introverted thinking is the dominant function for ISTPs and INTPs. This leads to them being very logical, but unlike the ENTJs and the ESTJs, it's often their own logical framework that's doing the computing. So a lot of times they like to figure out how things work and how their logic can fit into whatever it is they're observing. So this leads to them coming up to their own conclusions about like how things logically work out. But it also leads to them not being very forceful about their logic. Sure, if they haven't developed their extroverted feeling enough, they can sometimes give very cutting remarks like, "Oh my gosh, that was such a brain dead statement that you made." But those that have developed their extroverted feeling are often more considerate than you would think. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We'll get to extroverted feeling when we get to it. For these types, they often like to tinker in, say, machinery or computer science because that often involves them figuring out a complex system on their own. It can also lead to them sometimes delving into postmodernistic territory because they often don't think about universal truths or statistics. This can lead to them saying like, well, everything is relative and your truth is okay for you, but this is my truth. And it can lead to them being surprisingly defensive if you try to say that they're wrong because they think that they've got it all figured out. It can also lead to them being like so logical that they don't know how to compute anything that couldn't be logical. So oftentimes you try to say how you feel, they're like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so everything is about sense and their own logical framework. It can also lead to them not necessarily knowing how to explain the conclusions they come to. I think they're better at it than, say, those with introverted thinking lower down. But oftentimes, because it's their own logical framework, since the other people don't have the same wiring in their brain, they can be like, where the heck did you get to that conclusion from? Okay, this is my blind spot function, so let's see how well I can describe this. Next up, we have extroverted feeling, which is the dominant function for ESFJs and ENFJs. This leads to them having a strong desire for harmony and everyone to get along and creating a system where as many people are happy as possible. Usually ENFJs and ESFJs love to be in positions where they can help people, and to them there's no greater joy in the world than seeing other people smiling. However, unlike the INFJs and ISFJs, ENFJs and ESFJs tend to be more active and in organizational roles where they like to develop some kind of movement or a group or something along the lines of making lots of people happy, and they get energy from getting people to come out of their shells. They can be a bit more forceful about getting people to explain their emotions than an INFJ or an ISFJ would, often being like, let's unravel the layers. Tell me how you're feeling. Let's unpack all of that. And it can lead to the other types being a bit annoyed by that, especially if you're me, because I'm like, don't presume to know what I'm feeling, or like, hey, I'm going to share my feelings when I want to. Don't force me to overshare. But on the plus side, they almost never have bad intentions. Oftentimes, they're very altruistic and they want the good of the people, but it can also lead to them neglecting their own feelings in the process, and oftentimes they have to be told to slow down and introspect a little bit. They also have a tendency to not trust their own conclusions on things, instead focusing so much on how other people feel that it's hard for them to develop an idea of how things work for them personally. So whereas INFJs and ISFJs have introverted thinking in the tertiary, so that can lead to them like sort of having a certain degree of personal understanding. ENFJs and ESFJs are often like, my conclusions don't mean anything, I'm probably wrong. And so they constantly second guess themselves and have to be told like, hey, we want to hear your opinions. They might be wrong, but we still want to hear them. And who knows, maybe they're right. But they just don't like to admit it because, again, they're too busy thinking about what can we do to revolutionize the terrible moments in society? So this can lead to them often starting up, like, say, look at Martin Luther King Jr., who started up the Black Rights Movement. I am literally starting to get a headache right now. because we're moving on to my 8th function. So there just happened to be stuff in my eyes that wasn't crying. Although if I was a more emotional type, I wouldn't be ashamed of admitting that I was crying, because introverted intuition, oh gosh, that is such a pain to describe. Introverted intuition, okay, let's see how well I can do. You can do this, Paul, is the dominant function for INFJs and INTJs. This leads to them having this very mysterious ability to know the future, know what they want, and go for it. Oftentimes, they are told that they're like the fortune tellers of the Myers-Briggs community, because they're often eerily accurate in like what they predict will happen. And a lot of times they claim that it's not so much what they're predicting, but it's that they either just knew, or that there were enough patterns that the future outcome is so obvious. But a lot of times they don't know how to explain how they got to their conclusions. A lot of times you're like, how the heck did you figure that out? They're like, it was a gut feeling. And the other types don't trust their gut as much. So this can lead to them being like, you're telling me that your stomach felt weird, and that led to you being able to tell how I was feeling? And they're like, no, I don't mean that literally. Oftentimes, they don't think about things in the literal concrete form. They're often very abstract and big picture focused. So they like to think, how does everything fit together? How can my goals align with all these other factors? Usually they're pretty good at detecting possibilities of how things could go. So oftentimes when they're planning something going forward, the other types might say, have you considered? They're like, yep, I already had that in mind. And so it usually leads to them not being blindsided by other possibilities. However, when they're around people that have developed their extroverted intuition, it can lead to them being easily caught off guard by wild ideas, because introverted intuition is about looking deeper and looking more like intensely at a possibility, whereas extroverted intuition is all about external possibilities. So an extroverted intuitive might come up with this super wild, crazy idea, and the INFJ or INTJ is like, oh, yeah, I guess that's something to think about. And so they usually don't know how to respond adequately. An unhealthy INFJ or INTJ can develop what's called tunnel vision, where they get so focused on their future goals that they neglect their own, it could be their own appearance, their own household. They often have trouble noticing what's around them because of extroverted sensing in the inferior. So they might get so focused on their goals that they might, like, I don't know, let their hair be uncombed or unchecked. They might forget to eat. They might have their room constantly be messy because they're like, I don't have time for that sensory nonsense. I got to get my plan going. And they often, like, it's usually very hard to dissuade them from going against their plans. The sensors like me might be like, are you sure that's going to happen? That's in the future. They're like, oh no, I'm going to make it happen. The INTJs are a little bit better at making it happen because they have extroverted thinking. INFJs, they can be futuristic, but it usually takes them a while to accumulate the knowledge on how to do it because of extroverted thinking in the 7th. But thankfully, most INFJs that I know usually do follow through with their goals, even if it usually takes them until their 20s or 30s to get to that point. Okay, I think I've described all the functions. I don't usually take aspirins, but I'm gonna go do something that's a bit less requiring so much thinking and explaining the abstract. So I hope you enjoyed this trip down function lane. Let me know what type you are and if you're related to any of the cognitive functions I described. You might not relate to them being in the dominant, but maybe you could say like, yeah, I can relate to bits and pieces of that function that you mentioned, maybe just with more or less intensity than you described. So, again, headache. Thank you very much to my patrons Matthew Rakowski, Sploonghost, Splatcat, and Scooterdoodle for their financial contributions on Patreon. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye! Oh, I hope I'm not coming down with something.